Hello, we are here for day 14 of Mice and Men. No particular warm-up for today, so we're just going to jump right into the lesson. The lesson, readers look for times when a character knows they're doing something wrong. This choice is important because it is an insight into the values of the character and the themes in the novel. So we're specifically putting wrong in quotes because it might be wrong according to the book, but not actually a wrong choice. But according to the society they're in or the people they're around, they are doing something wrong. So we want to see what that tells us about the person and then what theme that can relate to as we're starting to talk about theme when we're ending our book. So we are starting on page 79, the very, very end of page 79. We ended with Curly's wife showing up in the barn where Candy and Crooks and Lenny are talking, and they kind of have been talking about the ranch and maybe all going in together. Even Crooks has kind of said, hey, maybe you want to take me? And Curly's wife comes in and she just wants to talk, and they don't want to talk to her because they're afraid it's going to cause trouble, and she gets mad. She starts insulting them, and it's kind of a heated moment right now. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her, and she looked longest at Lenny until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, where'd you get them bruises on your face? Lenny looked up guiltily. Who, me? Yeah, you. Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. He got his hand caught in a machine, he said. Curly's wife laughed. Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines. Candy broke in. You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? Lenny smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple rabbits myself. Crook stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in a scorn. Listen, black man, she said. You know what I can do to you if you open your trap? Crook stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down in his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. You know what I could do? Crook seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Well, you keep your place then, black man. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again, but Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. If you was to do that, we'd tell, he said quietly. We'd tell about you framing Crooks. Tell him be damned, she cried. Nobody would listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you. Candy subsided. No, he agreed. Nobody'd listen to us. Lenny whined. I wish George was here. I wish George was here. Candy stepped over to him. Don't you worry none, he said. I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet. He turned to Curly's wife. You better go home now, he said quietly. If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here. She praised him coolly. I ain't sure you heard nothing. Better not take no chances, he said. If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way. She turned to Lenny. I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. You got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself. She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted, and some stamped their feet. Crook seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. Was that the truth, what you said about the guys come back? He asked. Sure, I heard 'em. Well, I didn't hear nothing. And the gate banged, Candy said, and he went on. Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. Guess she had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. Colored man gotta have some rights, even if you don't like 'em. Candy said, that bitch didn't have ought to said that to you. It wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys coming in and setting made me forget. What she says is true. The horses snorted out in the barn, and the chains rang, and a voice called, Lenny! Well, Lenny, you in the barn? It's George, Lenny cried, and he answered, Here, George, I'm right in here. In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. What you doing in Crook's room? You ain't ought to be in here. Crooks nodded. I told them. They'd come in anyway. Why don't you kick 'em out? I didn't care much, said Crooks. Lenny's a nice fella. Now Candy aroused himself. Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits. George scowled. I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that. Candy was crestfallen. Didn't tell nobody but Crooks. George said, well, you guys get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute. Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, Candy? Huh. Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Yeah, said Candy, I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night. The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and bag, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back. Okay, so Curly's wife threatens Crooks when Crooks finally says, look, I've had enough, get out of my room. And she threatens to have him hanged if basically he talks back to her anymore. And that is when we just really see that like disgusting treatment of him because he's black and she uses the racist terms and she just like throws them at him in a very, very racist fashion and says, I'll just have him string you up. And that's when we have our quote. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. And he just completely shuts in on himself because he knows that she does have that power to do that, no matter what Candy or Lenny would say, because Candy and Lenny are also considered weak. And the second half that I pulled for that was, remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it, just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. So he pulls back from wanting to be on the ranch. And he says he wouldn't want to be any place like that. But what hopefully you've picked up on is he just had pointed out to him again that he's not like everybody else, that he's supposedly not equal. So there's something wrong that Crooks did was believing he was equal to the other men. Now, again, it's not actually wrong, but according to the society of the time, he was not equal. So that's his thing wrong that he does. The theme goes back to that loss of paradise. Crooks was for a second thinking, man, I can go and be one of the guys and be on this ranch and have this paradise. And then Curly's wife just shattered it for him. I think, yes, that's the only quote we have from this section. We are going to continue on to the next chapter to read more about what people have done that is maybe wrong. So let's start in the next chapter. One end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the 4-taloned Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats the heads of horses could be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay, and they stamped their feet and they bit the wood of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzz of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg and the shouts of men playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. Only Lenny was in the barn, and Lenny sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lenny sat in the hay and looked at a little, dead puppy that lay in front of him. Lenny looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, "Why do you gotta get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard." He bent the pup's head up and looked in its face, and he said to it, "Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed." He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay out of sight. But he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, "This ain't no bad thing, like I gotta go hide in the brush. Oh no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead." He unburied the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it from ears to tail. He went on sorrowfully, "But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, 'You done it, don't you try to put nothing over on me.' And he'll say, 'Now just for that you don't get to tend no rabbits.'" Suddenly his anger arose. "God damn you," he cried. "Why do you gotta get killed? You ain't so little as mice." He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." He rocked himself back and forth. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake and then a little chorus of cries. Lenny got up and brought the puppy back and laid it on the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. "You wasn't big enough," he said. "They told me you wasn't. I didn't know you'd get killed so easy." He worked his fingers on the pup's limp ear. "Maybe George won't care," he said. "This here goddamn little son of a bitch wasn't nothing to George." Okay. So, Lenny killed the dog. So far we've had Lenny killing mice, Lenny grabbing girls and not letting go. Lenny crushing the bones in Curly's hand. Now Lenny's killed a puppy. So that's the something wrong Lenny has done here. And it also relates to the theme, that loss of paradise. Because what Lenny worries about is not that he killed a dog. He's worried that now he won't get to tend the rabbits, because that's his paradise. And he's trying to figure out how to work this situation so that George still lets him tend the rabbits. There is no real thought from Lenny that he's actually done something wrong in the sense of killing the puppy, but just wrong because he won't get to tend the rabbits. And that's important to note. Okay, so he's upset in the barn trying to figure out how to handle that. All right, and then here comes Curly's wife. Curly's wife came around the end of the last stall. She came very quietly so that Lenny didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, "What you got there, sonny boy?" Lenny glared at her. "George says I ain't to have nothing to do with you, talk to you or nothing." She laughed. "George giving you orders about everything?" Lenny looked down at the hay. "Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything," she said quietly. "He's scared Curly'll get mad." "Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, he can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting it caught in no machine." But Lenny was not to be drawn. "No, sir, I ain't gonna talk to you or nothing." She knelt in the hay beside him. "Listen," she said, "all the guys got a horseshoe tournament going on. It's only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is going to leave that tournament. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." Lenny said, "I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing." "I get lonely," she said. "You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How'd you like to not talk to anybody?" Lenny says, "Well, I ain't supposed to. George is scared I'll get in trouble." She changed the subject. "She got covered up there." Then all of Lenny's woe come back to him. "Just my pup," he said sadly. "Just my little pup." And he swept the hay from on top of it. "Why, he's dead," she cried. "He was so little," said Lenny. "I was just playing with him, and he made like he's gonna bite me, and I made like I was gonna smack him, and I done it. And then he was dead." She consoled him. "Don't you worry none. He was just a mutt. You can get another one easy. Whole country is full of mutts." "It ain't that so much," Lenny explained miserably. "George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now." "Why don't he?" "Well, he said if I done any more bad things that he ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits." She moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. "Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell up there. They got $4 bets in the tournament. None of them gonna leave till it's over." "George sees me talking to you. He'll give me hell," Lenny said cautiously. "He told me so." Her face grew angry. "What's the matter with me?" she cried. "Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What do they think I am anyway? You're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you." "Well, George says he'll get us in a mess." "Aw, nuts," she said. "What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like they ain't none of them cares how I gotta live. I tell you I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself," she said darkly. "Maybe I will yet." And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. "I lived right in Salinas," she said. "Come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come through and I met one of the actors. He said I could go with that show, but my old lady wouldn't let me. She says because I was only 15, but the guy says I coulda. If I'd went, I wouldn't be living like this, you bet." Lenny stroked the pup back and forth. "We're gonna have a little place. And rabbits," he explained. She went on with her story quickly before she could be interrupted. "Another time I met a guy and he was in pictures. Went out to the Riverside Dance Palace with him. He said he was going to put me in the movies. Says I was a natural. As soon as he got back to Hollywood, he was going to write to me about it." She looked closely at Lenny to see whether she was impressing him. "I never got that letter," she said. "I always thought my old lady stole it. I wasn't going to stay in no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself where they stole your letters. I asked her if she stole it too, and she says no. So I married Curly. Met him out to the Riverside Dance Palace that same night," she demanded. "You listening?" "Me? Sure. Well, I hadn't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella." And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. "Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes. All them nice clothes like they wear, and I could have sat in the big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And all them nice clothes like they wear because this guy says I was a natural." She looked up at Lenny and she made a small grand gesture with her arm and hand to show that she could act. The fingers trailed after her leading wrist and her little finger stuck out grandly from the rest. Lenny sighed deeply. From outside came the clang of a horseshoe on metal and then a chorus of cheers. "Somebody made a ringer," said Curly's wife. Maybe now the light was shifting as the sun went down and the sun streaks climbed climbed up the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lenny said, maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George wouldn't never know. And then I could tend the rabbits without no trouble. Curly's wife said angrily, don't you think of nothing but rabbits? We're going to have a little place, Lenny explained patiently. We're going to have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa, and all the alfalfa's for the rabbits, and I take a sack and get all the alfalfa and get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits. Okay, so we learn a little bit more about Curly's wife and kind of how she ended up there. She talks about how she thought she was going to be in the movies, and these men said they'd put her in the movies and they'd write her letters and take her to Hollywood, and that didn't happen. And she thinks it's because her mom sabotaged her. Likely that those men were just telling her what she wanted to hear. But her talking to, or her something wrong, is talking to the men on the ranch. She's told she can't talk to them, and she says, what am I supposed to do? I can only talk to Curly, and he's not even that nice. And like, what have I done wrong that means you guys can't talk to me? And again, that theme of loss of paradise. She wanted to be an actress. She wanted this whole life, and now she has to live this life that doesn't make her happy. She can't even talk to anybody, much less be an actress. Okay? So those are some of the wrong things that our characters are doing. So in your book, even if you can't find it today, if there's been another portion in your book where somebody's been breaking a rule or doing something even though they know there will be negative consequences, what have those things been? And then think about what theme those could relate to. All of our something wrongs today related to loss of paradise. So you also have an exit ticket to make sure that you answer, kind of just relating the book to yourself, making a connection. We only have 2 more days left of the book. I've got some pretty exciting moments coming up. So we'll see you for the next day.